Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. This is Season 10, Episode 19. I'm your host, Dean Jones, and I'm here to talk about all things food and writing. You ever wondered about cookbooks, how old they are, how long have they been written, who were some of the earliest food writers? Well, today we're talking with returning guest, author and food historian Neil Buttery, about one of the most famous British food writers of all time, Elizabeth Raffald. Elizabeth Raffald was the author of the 1769 book, The Experienced English Housekeeper. She provides 800 recipes written with such clear direction and qualities that you can still cook with them today. Her book covered everything from cooking and cleaning to childcare and etiquette. It was a comprehensive guide to running a Victorian household, and it helped shape British food culture for generations to come. Our guest Neil Buttery is an author, food historian, and chef who specializes in the history of British food. His first book, A Dark History of Sugar, was published in 2022 to much acclaim. Today we are talking about his recent biography and the aforementioned Manchester legend, Elizabeth Raffald. His book, Before Miss Beeton, Elizabeth Raffald, England's Most Influential Housekeeper, is out now. I'm now going to take you to my conversation with Neil Buttery. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today, I'm very excited to welcome back to the podcast Neil Buttery, who is an author, food historian, and chef who's written the book, A Dark History of Sugar, which was published in 2022, and we had him on the program to talk about the book. Now he's speaking about a new topic. He's talking about Elizabeth Raffald and Before Miss Beeton, Elizabeth Raffald, England's Most Influential Housekeeper is the name of the new book. Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Now, for our listeners unfamiliar with your work, can you talk about yourself a bit and where you're from?
Yeah, well, I'm a food historian. That's the title I've given myself, I suppose. It's not really a job that has a real career path towards it. I've been chipping away at it now for about, I suppose, 15 years. And I've been kind of really seriously studying it, I suppose, for the last 8 or 9 years, I would say. Cooking as well as researching and writing have been two parallel things for me. I taught myself to cook as I taught myself the history. I didn't realize I was doing either really at the time, but I just got very obsessed with traditional cooking first, and then got more and more interested in the kind of, the setting that all that kind of tradition sits in, and the wider history and implications of that. And well, I mean, I'm a bit of a topic butterfly. I don't focus on one particular area for very long. I usually flutter off to something else, except for, I suppose, Elizabeth Raffald. That is a topic. She was a woman that's dear to my heart, and someone that I've been really interested in for pretty much the whole time. I've been obsessed with traditional British cookery and the history of British food.
Well, this is no pithy topic. I really was thrilled to get your book and to read it, and I was kind of, to be honest with you, my jaw dropped a few times. I was really not knowing what I was going to expect going into this, and I was very pleasantly surprised at the subject matter. It's a very fascinating topic. So tell us, who was Elizabeth Raffald?
Well, that was the hard sell really with the book, because nobody's heard of her, or very few people have heard of her. She was an 18th century, well, I suppose she's famous, if you do know her, she's famous for her 1769 cookery book, The Experienced English Housekeeper. It ran to many, many editions. So that's why people might know her, but she did so much more than that. She spent a good 15 years of her life in domestic service, became a housekeeper, and then spent the rest of her life in Manchester town centre. It was not yet a city. So this is the north of England, northwest of England. And she was, what didn't she do? She was an entrepreneur, a cook, a writer, a pillar of the community, everything really. Her list of achievements is huge. And I usually have to have a list of her achievements next to me, because I always miss a few out otherwise. Because, she's an overachiever, to be honest. It makes everyone It makes me certainly feel a bit impotent looking at her achievements compared to mine.
Me as well. My God. I mean, she really was one of those first, what do they call it? I mean, we have these people today that do everything, and she was, I think, one of the first, wasn't she?
She was, yeah, she was one of the first, certainly one of the first women anyway, that we know of. I mean, there are loads of blokes doing loads of things, polymaths, I suppose
Yeah.
you could call them.
Yeah.
But I suppose Elizabeth was the first person, the first woman to really, I don't know, just fire herself out in lots of different directions. I think the difference was, she's a member of a proud member of the domestic classes. I
Yeah.
think that's fairly accurate to say. So she certainly wasn't a highly educated polymath with a big grand plan, like Isaac Newton or something. Elizabeth was being Elizabeth.
Yeah.
I don't think there was any big plan. She just very much just focused on her own stuff, and everything else followed. She was a remarkable woman, and no one's heard of her, and that was
Yeah.
really important. I wrote the sugar book for Pen and Sword. They approached me to write that one, even though it was a subject I'd had my eye on already. And they really liked it, so that was good because it was the first
Yeah.
book. And they said, "Do you have any other topics?" And I immediately said, "Elizabeth Raffald." Then they said, "Who's she?" And then I said, "This is all the stuff that she's done." And they immediately came back and said, "Yes, write that book." It really was that sort of quick. In a couple of days, it kind of just suddenly went from no second book to, oh my God, I've got to start a second book now.
Now, how did you discover her? Because, like you said, a lot of people haven't. Well, I mean, I don't want to give anything away because that's going to be brought up later. I guess you have and you haven't. So, how did you discover her?
Well, I got into all this traditional cooking and history malarkey by cooking the recipes in English Food by Jane Grigson, the great Jane Grigson.
Mm-hmm.
And recipe number 40, at least it's actually towards the back of the book, but the 40th recipe that I cooked was Elizabeth Raffald's orange custards.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Which are really nice, made from Seville oranges, really delicious. And I don't know if you've ever read anything by Jane Grigson. She writes these amazing introductions to her recipes. In fact, sometimes the recipes are as important as the history or whatever that she's trying to communicate to us. And in that introduction, she gave a potted introduction. Oh, sorry, a potted biography of Elizabeth's achievements. And I just couldn't believe the list that was before me. She was famous for a book, The Experienced English Housekeeper, like I said, but that was last on this great big list. She opened shops, ran taverns, was the housekeeper of a huge stately home. She opened, what else she said she should do? So this is where I end up forgetting. She saved one newspaper from going bankrupt and opened a second one.
Oh my God.
She had her own finishing school for young ladies. She wrote 3 editions of a directory, so basically a Yellow Pages of Manchester and Salford.
Oh my God.
There were about 20,000 people living there at the time. She wrote 3 editions of that, it would turn out, when I researched it. It's just the list just goes on, and I just thought, I need to know about this person a little bit more. So I bought a reissued version of the book. It's the first historical book I'd ever bought, because I just wanted to know more. And at that point, I was hooked. And I think that was the point where I got hooked on the actual history of food as well, the people and the personalities and the times behind it all, to give it that context. So really, Jane Grigson and Elizabeth Raffald have been with me pretty much from the beginning of this. So they're both very important women to me.
Now, in addition to all the things that I read that she's done, which is just incredible to my mind. I don't know how she must not have ever slept, but she had 16 children as well, which was that true? She had 16 kids?
I can't find evidence for 16. I found 9, which is still pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Some of those children unfortunately died very soon after birth or as infants.
Yeah.
Of the children that I could find, only 3 lived to adulthood, unfortunately. There was a
Oh, that's
family
horrible.
Bible. Yeah. I mean, perhaps we'll come on to that later, the reasons maybe why that was specifically for Elizabeth. But yes, there was a family Bible that was written by Elizabeth that certainly was knocking around in the 19th century because it's mentioned a lot in some of the secondary sources, but now has been lost for a long time. So it was in the family Bible where this claim apparently was made. And perhaps, and quite rightly, in amongst those 16, she's including stillbirths or miscarriages.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So, it's what's counted as a birth, what you if you're going against evidence or family legend. I mean, it's always more fun to believe in the legend, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I saw something about her exorcising evil spirits from an English home. Was that listed as well?
Now, that wasn't listed in the Jane Grigson introduction. No. Yeah, what a crazy story that is. Yeah, this comes a little bit as she's a little bit older and she's well established in Manchester. Her father must have died and left her a property in his will, and her sisters, and it must be a home, and nobody's renting this home out. It's in Yorkshire because she's originally from Yorkshire. Yeah, no one will take this place because it's haunted by this evil spirit. So apparently she and her sister go to this without a male chaperone, shock horror, go into this building, and this kind of bright spectral thing comes running at them with all kind of lightning coming out of her and wailing in her faces and shaking around deeds and things. And she very easily kind of says, "Oh, go away, horrible spirit," and the horrible spirit goes away and it all works out fine.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I don't know what side your bread's buttered on, Dean, but ghosts don't exist, so it's not true.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
You can disagree with me there.
But, no, I'm on. Yeah.
The point of it isn't whether it's true or not. The point is that story's been attributed to her. That she's such a strong-headed, indefatigable woman who takes no nonsense. She's not going to even take nonsense from the dead.
Yeah. It's quite a selling point if you're looking for somebody to manage your household affairs.
Well, indeed. Yeah, I mean, you certainly want to be on the right side of Raffald. I mean, it's hard to tell what kind of person she was, but I'm sure you don't want to be on the wrong side of her.
Now, you mentioned that you got a copy of the Experience English Housekeeper. My God, is it a tome? Like, could you kill an ox with it? It sounds like, I mean, just looking at the index, it looks like an enormous work.
Well, there are many, many copies of it. And, well, actually, do you know what? Just next to me here, so I managed to get a first edition. So it doesn't look that big. So here it is.
Wow.
It's smaller than my head. Fairly normal, like a paperback book size, I suppose, actually.
Yeah.
It's a small hardback book.
It still looks pretty comprehensive, though.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here. I mean, there's hundreds of recipes in here. It's really dense. Yeah, I was very lucky to get hold of a copy. There's not many around. If I'm right, in fact, I've got the piece of paper in front of me. There are 8 copies left in the UK, of which this is one of them, and 9 in the US, first editions. As far as we know, that's it. So there's not many left. So I was very lucky to get my hands on it. The reason I could even afford it without having to remortgage my house was the fact that there's quite a few pages missing out of it. So it meant I could afford it. But there's a very important reason why I wanted to get my hands on this, but I think we might be getting to that later. So I'm not going to get ahead of myself. I'm just going to leave that hanging.
Oh, so I was going to say, books were like not as prolific as they were today. Like they were probably more expensive and they're hard to get. I mean, was this something that was kind of groundbreaking for this time period?
Yes. Books were certainly around, but books were written by men for men.
Yeah.
In the main. They were expensive. Levels of literacy were low, particularly for women at this point. About a third of women were fully literate. And the majority of those, we assume, are members of the middle and upper classes.
Right.
So it wasn't an even spread. Elizabeth's father was actually a tutor. So he gave all of his daughters a good step up in life because they all left the home, even though certainly two of them went into domestic service. They all could read, they could all speak French. So
wow.
they were really, immediately set apart from their peers, just from their home education. But I mean, I think Elizabeth really was she's not the first woman to have a book published.
Right.
Women at the time were expected to publish books that were about cooking or some kind of self-help.
Yeah.
And then if they were allowed to write proper books, it had to be kind of romantic fiction. So there was very strict boundaries. Elizabeth, to be fair, I mean, she stayed within her boundaries. But what she didn't do, it was how she dealt with the business and the publication of the book. She'd seen so many other women write extremely successful books, but had been basically talked into giving up their copyrights immediately. So a publisher would say, well, here's a few pounds. That the author would go off going, well, that's pretty good. And then they'd watch it become a bestseller. And they must have just been absolutely reeling from that. Elizabeth had seen that happen to too many people. So she did not give up her copyright on the first. She didn't give up her copyright on the second. She did on the third, and she made an absolute killing.
Yeah.
It made her a very rich woman. £1,200 she got at the time. It's hard to turn into modern currency, these things, but when she was a housekeeper, she was getting £16 a year.
Right.
As a well-paid servant. So it's a huge amount of money.
Oh, yeah.
And she really paved the way then to really, for more women to really be more confident when it came to publishing books. And it was so popular, her way of writing, that all the men who'd been writing kind of royal court cookery before her suddenly changed their writing style and kind of made themselves sound more like her. It's quite a complete shift in the way both genders talked to their readership.
Now, she had a very specific style of writing. Am I correct? It was very different for the rest of the time period where, did she have her own way of doing recipes and kind of writing?
Well, yeah. I mean, her own way seems ludicrous to say that it's some kind of amazing breakthrough thing, but it was at the time. She gave details.
Yeah.
Going back to those older books, all about court cookery and about showing off. It was written for male cooks or French chefs to be working their way through. And it was a reminder for them what to do. Or if there was a variation, it would assume you knew how to make the dish. It would just include the instructions for a variation. Whereas with Elizabeth, she knew for the first time, people were going to be buying these books, housewives of well-to-do houses.
Yeah.
She knew for the first time that these people didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
They were probably employing just one or two members of staff. Often it was a poor old maid of all work who had to do everything. So she gave pounds and ounces, how spoons of this, how hot things should be. And what she also did was, say there's a recipe for, I don't know, frying fish or something. Older recipes would say, fry your fish in hot oil, and when it is enough, serve it forth. And you go, well, thanks for that. That was no use to me. Whereas she said, this is how hot, this is what the fire should look like. This is how you can tell how hot the oil is. Here's how to tell when your fish is done. Point a knife next to the backbone and it should just come away easily. Nobody was doing that sort of stuff because she had such good practical knowledge. All those recipes she'd been collecting her whole domestic life and her few years she had in Manchester. So they all worked, and she really believed in them. And her confidence, it wasn't a cocky confidence. She was just
Yeah.
very assured, which I think is really nice. I think people could very easily, lazy people could say, oh, she's bossy. Oh, she was a battle axe or something, which would just be, which kind of annoys me when people talk about that, about strong-headed women in general in those terms.
Yeah.
So I'm just really glad that she obviously was just doing it right, because nobody was saying that about her. Everybody really liked her and had a huge amount of respect for her. You know, even 75, 80 years after she died, people still had an amazing respect for her.
Now I really liked just looking at the index and seeing what she was doing. And she had a lot of different stuff that I wasn't expecting. I mean, of course, there was the recipes, etc., divided into categories, but there was also sections on keeping a garden and an orchard, as well as lists for every food in its own season. This seems remarkable. I mean, that must have been kind of a huge coup for the reader at that time period.
Yeah, I mean, there are other books actually that have more detail in a way. She really condensed it down to seasonality. I think what we don't realize is how much people had to plan.
Yeah.
People had to know what to expect. It's not like now where you can buy strawberries in January.
Yeah.
That being flown in from Mexico, you know, to England or whatever.
Yeah.
You really had to plan. You know, if there was a wedding on in December, you had to start planning that in probably June and started ordering things in June. So you really had to know what to expect so you could plan the whole year round. And what she actually did was, which I think was good, was she just focused on food. Other housekeepers' books, they go on about everything, especially things like medicines and what have you. And she's and animal husbandry. And there's a few mentions of animal husbandry in the book. But she's like, no, I'm just doing one thing and I'm going to do it really well. And she did it well. But what's remarkable, I mean, I've got the book here now, looking at the back, is just, it's amazing the variety. You know, it's a variety that we think we know variety.
Right.
When it comes to fruit and vegetables. But there's fruit and vegetables we've completely forgotten in the West. Yeah. And I've been looking at all sorts of seedsmen and market garden owners, and there's things like, you look and there's 24 different varieties of apricots.
Yeah.
You think, what? I couldn't name you 24 different varieties of stoned fruit, never mind apricots. But what's really good is it really gives away what people are able to get hold of, because in September, for example, August, September, there's pineapples and melons and things like that all being grown in England.
That's crazy.
Great expense. So it really gives you an idea of what sort of stuff she was able to get hold of, you know, because she was catering for also the very, very rich. So there's a good mixture of recipes in there that can appeal to, I guess, all types of employers of domestic servants. She's got the full gamut of recipes. If you want a 6-page recipe on how to dress a turtle, it's there. But if you want to know how to fry tripe, that's there too. And everything in between.
Now, she had the first recipe for a wedding cake. Is that true?
Now, I'm not sure. You might have to correct me. I'm not sure if this is a thing in North America or not. But fruitcakes being covered with a marzipan layer and a royal icing layer, it's a very British, I think of it as quite a British invention. But all wedding cakes from, I mean, she essentially invented that. It used to be a bride's pie before the cake was, it's this big mince pie. She'd break over the head of the bride for good luck.
Oh my God.
Yes, she's like, no, we need something a bit more refined than this, thank you. So it was a very rich fruit cake covered with this double layer. And I suppose people these days maybe have more posh cakes with, buttercreams and things like that now. But certainly
Yeah.
the royal family, whenever there's a wedding, there's always a traditional wedding cake made in that style. And in the UK, at least, it's also our traditional Christmas cake. So
Yeah.
it's a cake that's on most people's tables at some point in their lives at very important events or celebrations. So it's a very almost a humdrum thing now, but at least as far as as British people go, it's quite an important food stuff. My favorite
Now,
first of hers, though, is the mac and cheese.
really?
Yeah,
Yeah,
she's
you
the
wouldn't think
first.
of that. I guess I really never thought about that being something that was done then, but wow, is it similar? Is it the same as it is nowadays?
Yeah, I guess it's the same. You boil your macaroni and you mix it with, well, if I'm remembering rightly, it's lots of cream, and then they use this a lot in the recipes, a kind of a knob of butter rolled in flour, and you pop that in. I guess it just
Hmm,
thickens it up like a roux,
yeah.
and then loads of Parmesan cheese.
Huh.
It
Now,
sounds
was pasta
just
big
very
then? Was
simple.
was pasta being eaten back then, like as we do now, or was it coming into its own then?
No, it was eaten then, usually dried. Yeah.
Huh.
Although macaroni as a term was a bit more general. So it probably wasn't it may have been the elbow macaroni, but it's impossible to tell actually
Yeah.
what kind of pasta it was. But something like macaroni or penne pasta.
Hmm. Now, there were 13 editions of the book and 26 pirate editions. I remember reading a lot about the piracy of books. I know that Dickens had a problem with this quite a bit, but she had 26 pirate editions. Can you talk about the piracy, how prevalent it was, and how it affected the book's publication?
It was her number one worry when it came to publishing her book. She made sure that she signed in her lifetime. There were 7 editions of the book published in her lifetime, and she signed every single copy to
Wow.
prove that that was her book, and this book has her signature in it. So it happens every time. Every time I pick the book up, I get goose pimples, goose flesh. Um, it's just amazing that you've got a book there that's been scribbled on by her, and she was very right to be worried. Plagiarism was a really important, a really prevalent thing, and I think food. I'm pretty sure, certainly after she died, but I think even at the time, when it came to cooking, people just thought it was free game. We can just copy whatever we like.
Yeah.
And quite often, recipes would be switched around from other people's books, recipes that weren't tested, recipes that were sometimes poisonous would be
Oh dear
slotted
God.
into people's cookery books. So yeah, it was really serious. I mean, there was all sorts of publishing laws passed at the beginning of the 18th century, the very first copyright laws, but it took decades really for people to work that out now. And yeah, people just copied whole recipes, whole sections of recipes, word for word. Didn't even bother thinking about trying to hide the fact because it wasn't a shameful thing to do because everybody did it. Although the people that wrote those recipes, I'm sure, were pretty annoyed.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it just boggles my mind. But I mean, I know we have this issue today still going. Just recently, I remember hearing of examples of somebody, I won't say who, but they basically copied somebody's entire cookbook and published it as their own. And
Right.
you think that wouldn't happen today, but God, it still does. It's so weird. This episode is sponsored by Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit their website at www.chnorcal.org. Now, that takes me to the topic of Isabella Beeton, or otherwise Miss Beeton. Can we talk about her plagiarism a little bit?
Sure. Well, yeah, the Book of Household Management. It was published almost a century after Elizabeth's book. And that was, well, I mean, it was quite a cynical publication, I think, because the whole point of the book, I think, was to be so comprehensive and detailed that you didn't have to buy another book.
Yeah.
That was the whole point behind that book. And I don't know if you've ever seen a copy of it, but it's like a cube because it's so thick. It's just this big square book with thousands of recipes in there. Now, it's edited by Isabella Beeton. It's not written by her, if you look carefully. No one's claiming to have written that book.
Oh, I see. Gotcha.
And in fact, it wasn't even edited by Isabella Beeton, really. It was by her husband, James Beeton. Isabella had been working with him for one of his journals, women's journals. She wrote the fashion column.
Oh, I see.
She was not a cook. But what James could see was, he saw people like Elizabeth Raffald and other 18th century writers too, people like Hannah Glass, people might have heard of her, or Eliza Acton in the 19th century. And he saw, well, those women have done quite a good job of branding themselves. So I'm really going to do it, and I'm going to throw some money at it. And it was a bit like, I don't know, Coca-Cola or McDonald's or something, just, elbowing out all the competition. All of a sudden, with the publication of that book, he didn't have to own any other books. It just blew all the competition out of the water. So that's kind of one reason why Mrs. Beeton's in the title of the book, because the book was so popular. And hey, I use the book all the time. It's an amazing snapshot of cookery. All the recipes work. So I'm not knocking it from that point of view. It's a fantastic record, if nothing else. But I've lost my thread, Dean. What was I saying?
No, it reminds me of kind of the first example of corporate branding. You put somebody's name on something and you write it and put it out. It's almost like you're selling the person in a way, because people imagine, like, of course, they're going to think a woman wrote this, etc.
Yeah. Well, some women wrote this, because the reason that Mrs. Beeton's in the title of the book is, she's probably the one historical cook that most people have at least heard of. They might have heard of the name, but she in inverted commas, I call her the Colonel Sanders of
that makes
cookery
sense.
writers, because she did exist, but from the point of view of the books, it's just a made up person. There was a real Colonel Sanders, but who was he?
Yeah,
he's just a brand now. But the really cynical thing was, the most successful cookery book ever written, and it was written or collated using 100 years of other women's recipes that had preceded her, which is a kind of a bit of a cruel irony, really. And she did plagiarize Elizabeth. In fact, other people were worse off than Elizabeth when it came to Mrs. Beeton. But yeah, across the board, and people were up in arms about it. Quite a few female writers were just saying they're just stealing recipes, and there's nothing wrong with crediting your sources. People were saying that even then, but people just didn't care. And I think cookery, the area of cookery, is still open to plagiarism. You mentioned that example earlier, because you can't copyright a recipe.
Yeah.
You can copyright the words you use to describe the method. You can't just copy and paste that. But, a recipe for something as basic as a pound cake, well, there's pound cake recipes the same everywhere you go. Same ingredients, same amounts, you do exactly the same thing. So it is a gray area. It's not like literature or something.
Are there any modern chefs that you would compare Miss Raffald to?
For sure. I would say three. One is the Canadian chef Jennifer McClagan. I don't know if you've come across her.
Yeah.
She wrote a fantastic book called Odd Bits. She's very pro offal. Offal's represented a lot in Elizabeth's book because people were buying whole carcasses, sometimes killing those animals themselves, and the sirloin was just as valuable as the trotters or the head or the kidneys or whatever. So Jennifer really loved Elizabeth, and she talks about her a lot in her book. And there's a fantastic recipe for calf's foot jelly. You can make your own jelly from rendering the gelatin out of some calf's feet, if you like. So that's nice. So definitely her. Fergus Henderson, the head chef or owner of St. John restaurant in London, the nose to tail chef.
I know him very well. I love him. I adore him. I just adore his cookbooks.
Yeah, they're absolutely fantastic. And although I couldn't find him mentioning her name, there's some recipes that are just so similar that if he doesn't know that they're Elizabeth's, and I'm fairly sure that he does know that they're Elizabeth's, or similar to hers, that he's obviously looking at books whose authors plagiarized her work.
Yeah,
because they're very similar indeed. And I suppose the third person is Heston Blumenthal.
Oh yeah.
And the reason I'm listing him is because of the eye for theatricality that Elizabeth really had, and it's really what put her head and shoulders above the other housekeepers, because she just made these amazing creations that would sit in the center of a table. She made these great big jelly sculptures, which she seemed to have invented herself, as far as I can see anyway. Lots of people copied her recipes, certainly from that section of the book. Yeah, Solomon's Temple in Flummery. So, great, like big basilica with. She did these kind of whimsical things. She made fake bacon and eggs out of it by dyeing, jelly in Flummery, which at that point
did you do that recently?
I did.
I saw that. That was ingenious. I didn't know I thought it was just bacon and eggs at first. And then I had to kind of look at it and read it. I'm going, wait a minute. That was pretty impressive.
Well, I'm not very patient. Yeah, that was her. That was one of hers. She does one.
Oh, wow.
There's one that I don't even understand how she does it. It almost defies physics. I mean, I certainly don't have the patience to work this one out, but it's a fish. So it's a flummery fish. So that's just basically an almond milk jelly.
Right.
And it's sat floating in transparent jelly. And the fish itself is covered in gold leaf.
Dear God.
I don't understand how that can be.
And I
don't have the patience to work that one out. But she was a magician. In fact, I mean, talking about her achievements, one thing that I just do not understand after reading about her for so many years, and of course, writing about her and trying to sort it into some kind of narrative story, I still don't know how she did all the things that she did. That is the one big mystery. She was a magician. See,
was she pretty famous? I mean, was she pretty famous for her time period? Was she pretty well known?
She was really well known, but her book was the book to buy for new brides to help them in their new homes. And then, of course, at those weddings, it was her wedding cakes that were being eaten as well. So I kind of think that's quite interesting. She was famous in North America. She was, I think, the second female author to have a book printed in North America.
Wow. That's a pretty big deal.
Second or third, not the first. So she was a household name certainly across England. And it was really influential, because for the first time, people weren't being too aspirational and just wanted to eat what the aristocracy and the kings and the queens were eating. It was more about eating their own food, the food that everybody else ate. And from Elizabeth and the years after she died, as all her recipes begin to be plagiarized in other people's books, what you suddenly find is people up in, I don't know, Northumbria, very north of England, are cooking the same recipes as people in Devon down in the very opposite end of the country. And this kind of big unification, I suppose, of English food culture started to develop. And of course, she's not the only one. There's lots of other people contributing to this. I'm just kind of saying she's the most important, I suppose. So when you look through her book, okay, there's some weird and wonderful stuff in there. It's represented, if that's what you want. It's there. But most of the time, it just reads like a book of traditional British food.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was cutting edge contemporary cuisine at the time. So we've got, it's our food culture kind of began with Elizabeth and her ilk as well, of course. I'm not going to miss out Eliza Smith, Hannah Glass, because they were important too. Just Elizabeth was just so good at taking what other people had done sometimes and just pitching it perfectly. The recipes worked. She didn't talk down to anybody because she knew servants would be reading that book. And she's like, right. I'm not going to be patronizing. These are my fellow workers. And at the same time, she also knew that their employers would be reading the book, sometimes for the women if they couldn't read themselves. And she didn't read her voice wasn't subordinate to them, which that had happened in previous books. What she was saying was, you can trust me to let me into your kitchen and I can help your staff and I can help you do a good job. I can help you express yourself or your family through all the special events that you put on. I can help you express yourself and do well for your family. So she was really empowering women in a way that other writers weren't. And that's a real secret. When it comes to a book, that's the real secret to her success. Just don't be patronizing and don't be subordinate. Just say, I'm going to help. I'm going to help.
I want to talk to you a bit about your book from last year, A Dark History of Sugar. So it's been a year since that came out, and I've seen it referenced by other writers. We recently had Regula Yesuin on here, who has the book out, Dark Rye and Honey Cake, and other books, and she's referenced you, and I know that a lot of authors have. So how has the book been for you since it's been out for a year? I know that a lot of people are talking about it.
It's been really good. I mean, I'm so happy that it's been well received and people do use it. It was so difficult to write because there was so much information that had to be packed in there. It was a real, it's a good job there was a lockdown to do it in, because otherwise I wouldn't have had the time or the inclination.
Yeah.
So I'm really pleased how well it went down, because I was quite worried, because I was very aware that it's some white English bloke writing about the dark history of sugar. So I was worried that I was maybe not putting it in the right way, maybe naively or something like that. But yeah, so far anyway, everyone's been kind of positive about it and congratulatory about it. So I'm really pleased. Really pleased actually, because it's the first book. Of course, I didn't have anything to compare it to either.
What did this book change for you? I mean, how did it change things for you as a writer, as a food historian?
Well, on a personal level, it just really gave me the confidence to really push my own ideas and the way I do things. Because the great thing with the publisher, even though they contacted me, they said it needs to be 70,000 words long. Okay, and there was no other prerequisites. Write whatever you like. So for me, although it's an important subject, but for me it was just validation, and it's one of those things that because I am self-taught essentially. I didn't go to university to study this, although I suppose I went to university and learned how to research, and there's all sorts of transferable skills. So it's nice to know that I'm doing it in a way that is accessible. That's really important to me. I think as an ex-teacher, I think it's important to me that work is accessible for everybody without patronizing people, a bit like what I was saying about Elizabeth, but also not being afraid of tackling difficult things or complex things. So that's what I try and do. So I'm really happy that all different kinds of readers have all got something out of it. So it was real validation for me, and I'm much more confident now in my ideas and what have you. So that's been the main thing, I suppose.
Well, as I've said before, it has a wonderful quality of something you can almost see cinematically. I keep thinking this would make a great Netflix series. Any talk like of a documentary or documentary series, because I don't think it would just do justice for 2 hours. It would probably have to be like a seasonal experience. Any talk on a kind of a series from Netflix or somebody on this?
Not really. I have discussed it with some people, but in a very superficial way, like, wouldn't it be nice? But it is something that I thought about more. One thing that we didn't mention, actually, about Elizabeth was her directories that she wrote. Well, I mentioned them briefly, but we know everybody who lived in Manchester, what street they lived on, what number, and what they did.
Oh my God, that's right.
We've got the 18th century newspapers that she advertised throughout of her life in Manchester. That's how I could basically track what she was doing, by following the newspapers. But of course, everything else that's happening in Manchester at the time is in those newspapers. So it's all there written out for us. We could take people's lives and maybe use Elizabeth as the focus, but you could really build up an exciting, fully three-dimensional recreation of a working class, because it was a mainly working class place full of working class people anyway. It was the centre of cotton trade and things. And I think it could be a really interesting long-running show or something like that. I mean, it's something I have no experience in whatsoever, but I just think there's so much information there that's just sat there waiting for us just to tap into. And some really creative writers could do some excellent work, because there's little snapshots of things that are going on, which was so intriguing. It was so hard not to just sit there and read the newspaper that I was looking at every day. I just had to look for Elizabeth things and try not be distracted by all the other stuff that was going on.
It does really give us an idea of what it was like to live in this time period. And she was addressing needs of things that needed to exist, and she was manifesting them, which is just amazing. I really love getting a little window into this time period that we don't really know often about. We see things, I mean, I hasten to use something like Bridgerton or something like that, where we get an idea of something from these like romantic comedies and stuff like that, but it doesn't really give us any real idea of the time. Something like this does, though. It really kind of hits home what it might be like to, live during this time period. Like you mentioned, you can't just go out to the grocery, you can't go to the Tesco and get strawberries in January like you can now. It was a whole different ball game. You really had to work to create your food, and to just, for a family, for a household, it was, probably a considerable amount of work.
And I mean, at this point in time, there's in England anyway, there had never been such a gap between rich and poor. It might not even be as big ever again. Hopefully it won't be.
Yeah.
Certainly, well, we're not quite in George IV territory. We're in George II and III. So it's all big powdered wigs and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
We're talking about that kind of territory. And as Clarissa Dixon Wright, the cookery writer, said, for who could afford it, the Georgian larder was always full. I mean, right. I was talking about those varieties, but if you didn't have the money, you were starving.
Yeah.
So it was just such a world of inequality. And I think that is also, like you said, just a less romantic version of real life. I mean, if you were to make a drama, it would have to be romantic to some degree. But if you got Elizabeth in the center of it, then, I mean, that is romantic and it is real. I mean, if I just pitched to you an idea about a woman doing all those things, you'd have said, this is too far-fetched.
Yeah.
No way has one person done all this. So there is somebody who's a romantic figure and who was real.
Yeah.
Well,
it's kind of the Martha Stewart of her day.
Well, Martha Stewart's the Elizabeth Raffald of her day, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, that's where she took her cues. I want to talk to you about the British Food History Podcast. Now, I've been seeing a lot about this and it's been doing very well. Can you talk about your podcast a little bit, some of the guests you've had on?
Yeah, I'm really pleased with how well the podcast has done. It was something that I wanted to have a go at because it just seemed quite a lot of fun. And because I keep harking back to this, because I've taught myself, I don't actually have that many connections. I don't get to meet many people. So I thought it'd be a great a great way to meet people one-to-one. So that was the real reason why I did it. I'd made a few episodes with somebody who used to work for Radio 4 and ran a sort of community charity radio station. So we did that together as a bit of a project. And I went away from it thinking, well, this was really good fun. And I don't really care that nobody heard it. It was just good fun to do. So I left it sitting there for a while, and then I decided, I'm just going to do some episodes myself. And yeah, it's just gone really well. We've had some really good guests and subjects. I don't know if you know Annie Gray, Dr. Annie Gray, who's very well known in this country. Ivan Day is probably the most esteemed food historian in the country at the moment. In fact, I did a great episode. I mean, it was great. I mean, I didn't get a word in edgeways. He talked at me for an hour. But I was in his beautiful 17th century home. It's an old farmhouse up in the Lake District, and he's got some of these jelly molds of Elizabeth's. You know, he laid them all out, and he went through some of the books. So it's a great conversation. Well, I say conversation that I had with him about that one. Really nice. You know, he's a raconteur, really, is Ivan. So getting people on like that, and it's also good to talk to people about really niche topics as well. I like really getting quite geeky, like talking about the form of curry, for example.
Yeah.
You know, sort of obscure bits of history, and it seems to be going down quite well. So I'm just starting to put together some interviews for the next batch. So nice. Watch this space.
Yeah, we'll put links to it in the bio too. I recommend it. I'm a fan. So it's one of the. I have a rotation of different podcasts I listen to, and it's definitely on it because I love food history and I find it to be very fascinating. And you're a very genial host, and you pick really good guests. So it's very exciting stuff.
Oh, well, thank you. It's funny, isn't it? Food history. I mean, I just went to a symposium at the weekend about food history in York, and it's so looked down upon by academia as inconsequential and unimportant. And yet there's so many history programs about, well, it's usually Nazis or Tudors over here. Yeah. I don't know what it's like. It's usually Nazis or Tudors.
Pretty much the same over here.
If they could find a Nazi Tudor, they would be absolutely doing backflips with that one. But for some reason, you know, there are not many Nazis around. Unfortunately, there are some. There's certainly no Tudors around. And yet we're all still eating, every single one of us on the planet. And yet that's the thing that's kind of looked down upon as unimportant. I like to think that people are getting less interested in what kings and queens were doing and things like that. I think I'm certainly more interested in, you know, I don't care about what Queen Elizabeth was doing in the year 1600. I want to know what I would have been doing in the year 1600. That's much more interesting to me.
Well, I mean, I think that we've, the one thing that I think that you bring up a lot, but by way of your writing, is that food history shows us that we are very privileged now, and things are very different. And when we watch period dramas and stuff, those details are often left out. Oftentimes, food is used very sparingly in historical dramas. They'll have it, but it'll be barely there. But things like, to me, Downton Abbey has really shown. I mean, you see these workers working their ass off all day long to produce the food for the household. You know, it's not just they're just placing a grocery order. These people are, you know, probably growing the food, getting the food from local producers. They're doing all the heavy lifting, butchering it themselves, you know, collecting the eggs themselves, separating the cream from the milk themselves. It's all being done.
Yeah, brewing, even distilling their own spirits. I mean, they were doing everything, making their own medicines. Everything was in-house.
God, it's just a lot of work. I mean, I do a lot of cooking, and for my family, but even so, I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg comparatively to what people had to do all day long to
Well,
create their
that's it.
food.
I mean, I'm always talking about, try and do as much from scratch as possible, but I know that I'm talking absolute nonsense. I'm not boiling down my calf's feet to make jelly.
Yeah,
I'm buying packet gelatin, dissolving it in some hot water. That's what I'm doing. So we have all these arbitrary lines that we all kind of cast down, and anybody on the other side of our line isn't doing it properly. Um, so yeah, we do have to realize that, yeah, that it's such a double-edged sword, isn't it? We've got all this variety and food's so much more cheap, and you can eat big and eat quite grandly or seemingly grandly for not a huge amount of money, at least not by Georgian standards. But it's making us ill. All this big eating, those lower classes like you and I, Dean,
yeah,
be looking up at the lords and ladies eating all these fantastic giant jellies and sugary comfits and wanting it and driving all that stuff down to us, and now all of us can have it. Yeah, it's all a bit of a mess, really. Without being putting a downer on the end of the conversation.
well, it's funny because I watch
But it's
reality
true.
shows. I watch reality shows sometimes, and I'll see wealthy people eating kale, and I'm like, go to hell. I'm like,
Yeah.
you have millions of dollars, you're eating kale. Why would you be doing that? You should be eating filet mignon and nice food. What are you doing to yourself? You're just living off of water and kale. That's ridiculous. How would you do that? And I don't know. It just makes me a little bit mental,
Yeah.
because
And indeed, and going back to say Tudor times, of course, the peasantry was eating kale boiled in
yeah,
water. Cabbage
yeah,
water was a popular drink. You cooked your cabbage one day, and then you had the cabbage water the next day. um, and it's completely reversed now,
yeah,
because I guess it's more difficult to eat well and
yeah,
sparsely, because it's also tempting. So I guess it's showing off and having the time to go to gyms and affording to go to gyms and all that kind of stuff. It's all gone the other way around. Somebody who's slim and muscular or whatever, in times past, and tanned, meant they were working outside and they were
right,
poor. So you
yeah.
wanted to be pasty, flabby, um,
And now it's
with
reversed.
rotten
The lower,
teeth.
yeah. Now it's all reversed. But it's crazy. Like Jamie Oliver has talked about food inequality a lot, and in both Britain and this country. And you still see areas in this country where what you were talking about, where Elizabeth Raffald was talking about a class that had the food. They had the groaning larders, whereas people still nowadays have nothing in the pantry, and kids are drinking soda because it's cheaper than juice. So
Sure.
they can't get the fruit. Which is ridiculous. But we have food deserts in America. We don't talk about it because we're a proud country, and we like to gloss over the facts. And that is a fact that we have food scarcity here, which is ridiculous. But I don't know.
It is really. I mean, there's enough. The world creates enough food to feed everybody on the planet twice over, and yeah, I mean, I don't know what the percentage of people who are in food poverty in the world, but I mean, it's got to be getting on a half or something, mustn't it? It's going to
Yeah,
be a lot of people. Yeah. So I suppose in some ways, we're not that different to the Georgians, where there's a huge variety if you can afford it. Except, I guess that was in England. Now, I suppose we're having to enlarge that to the whole world now.
yeah,
Now we're a truly global planet.
yeah. It's crazy.
Mm.
Neil, I've loved having you on the podcast again. You've been a great guest. I hope to get to have you on here again. What's
Sure,
next
I'd
for
love to
you?
come on again. What is next for me? Well, I'm putting together the podcast, like I say. That should be coming out in hopefully June. Um, if I pull my finger out anyway, things sometimes get held up. Life gets in the way. I've just started book number 3,
Nice. That's what I
which
was hoping to hear.
is about quite different. Well, I suppose the other 2 books are quite different to each other. This one's actually about baking, because I'm a big baker.
Nice.
And
Very nice.
it's kind of about us. We haven't got a title yet. That'll come to us at some point. But it's kind of the evolution of baking.
Nice.
And it's going to be, I mean, there's going to be a lot of research required, but it's going to be even more straightforward to read. I'm going to write almost blog post length chapters, so you can kind of dip in and out of it. So it's a little bit different to the other things that I've written, where so it's not necessarily going to be a huge narrative there, but there's going to be a huge amount of detail, and hopefully when people have read it, they'll get an idea of the history, but also hopefully they'd be better bakers, because I'm also going to be talking about the science that's kind of discovered along with the techniques and the foods. So that's the aim. We'll see how it turns out. Sometimes the outcome is different to the aim.
Very nice. Now, Neil, I want to tell people we're going to have links to your book, Before Miss Beeton, Elizabeth Raffald, England's most influential housekeeper. That'll be in the bio. Also, we'll have links to the podcast as well, the British Food History Podcast. Neil, thanks for being on the podcast again.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
That was my conversation with returning guest Neil Buttery. Neil is the author of the new book, Before Miss Beeton, Elizabeth Raffald, England's most influential housekeeper. This book's out now, and we have links to it and Neil's previous book in the bio. Next week, I am very honored and excited to have on the show barbecue expert Ed Mitchell. He's going to be talking about his new book, Ed Mitchell's Barbecue. Until next week, see you at the library.